The world ended before anyone realized it had begun. Cities fell, governments collapsed, and humanity was reduced to scattered pockets of survivors fighting for every breath. Among them were Ethan Carter, a hardened ex-military strategist, Mia Thompson, a resourceful nurse, and Dev Patel, a tech-savvy engineer. They were strangers before the apocalypse, but now, fate had forced them into an uneasy alliance. The night was thick with the scent of decay as Ethan led Mia and Dev through the wreckage of what was once Newport City. They moved quietly, their eyes darting across the abandoned cars and dark alleyways. The undead were everywhere, their grotesque forms shambling through the streets, drawn to the slightest sound. They weren't just running for survival, they were looking for answers. The outbreak had started 3 weeks ago, spreading like wildfire. The news called it a viral mutation, but no one lived long enough to confirm its origins. The infected weren't just mindless, they were fast, unpredictable, and worse, some of them seemed to be learning. Tonight, the trio was heading toward a rumored safe zone at the old military base, 15 miles north of the city. It was a long shot, but better than waiting to die. As they neared a gas station, Ethan raised his fist, a silent command for the group to halt. A guttural growl echoed from behind a crashed truck. Mia tensed, gripping her knife. Dev swallowed hard, clutching a metal pipe. Then, it appeared. A zombie, but not just any zombie. Its movements were unnervingly fast, its head twitching erratically as if it were sniffing the air. This wasn't like the others. It was evolving. Ethan reacted first. With military precision, he swung his machete, aiming for the neck. But the creature ducked, it ducked. No zombie had ever done that before. It lunged at Ethan, pinning him to the ground, its rotten teeth inches from his throat. Mia let out a scream and slashed at its exposed back. The knife barely sunk in before the zombie twisted its head unnaturally, staring at her with vacant but intelligent eyes. Dev, shaking, raised his pipe and slammed it down on the creature's skull. A sickening crunch followed. It staggered, but didn't fall. Ethan, using the moment of distraction, yanked a hidden dagger from his belt and stabbed it under the jaw, twisting until the thing collapsed lifelessly on top of him. Panting, he shoved the body aside and sat up. That wasn't normal, he said, rubbing his bruised ribs. Mia wiped blood from her face, still trembling. They're changing. Dev, still in shock, pointed to a burned-out diner across the street. We need to get inside before more of them come. Ethan nodded. Agreed. We need a plan. The group rushed into the diner, barricading the doors with broken chairs and tables. As they caught their breath, the reality of the situation hit them. The zombies weren't just spreading, they were evolving, adapting, learning. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back. The diner smelled of old grease and mildew, a haunting reminder of a world that no longer existed. Mia paced near the boarded-up windows, gripping her knife. Dev sat in a booth, still shaken from the earlier encounter. Ethan, ever the soldier, stood by the entrance, his eyes scanning for movement outside. Then, a sound came from the kitchen. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Dev instinctively reached for his metal pipe. Ethan motioned for them to stay quiet, raising his machete as he moved toward the noise. A cabinet door creaked. Ethan yanked it open, his weapon raised, only to find a terrified man curled up inside. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and hollow eyes. His clothes were filthy, and his face was sunken with starvation. He looked up at them, blinking in fear. "Please, don't kill me," he croaked. Mia rushed forward. "We're not here to hurt you." She helped the man out of the cabinet, offering him a bottle of water. "Who are you?" The man took a long gulp before speaking. "Name's Greg Saunders. Used to be a truck driver before all this." He gestured vaguely around him. "How long have you been hiding here?" Ethan asked. 2 weeks, Greg admitted. "I was with a group, but they didn't make it. The infected, they're not like before." His voice dropped to a whisper. "They're changing." "We know," Dev muttered, still shaken from their earlier fight. Greg leaned in. There's more. The military base you're heading to? It's not safe. Ethan narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? I heard a radio message a few nights ago, Greg continued. A distress call from someone inside the base. They said the infected broke through. They were begging for help, but then, he swallowed hard. Then the screams started. And the signal cut out. Mia's stomach turned. So, it's gone? Greg hesitated. Maybe not entirely. But if you go there unprepared, you'll die. The group sat in silence, processing the news. Their only hope of sanctuary might already be lost. Then, a faint crackle came from Dev's backpack. Everyone turned as Dev quickly unzipped it and pulled out a small handheld radio. He had been trying to fix it since the start of their journey, but until now, it had only produced static. Now, there was a voice. Hello? Is anyone out there? This is Lieutenant Marcus Hale of the Fort Ravenwood base. We are still holding, but we need reinforcements. Supplies are running low. Survivors, if you can hear this. Static. Ethan grabbed the radio. Repeat. We're survivors. What's your status? More static. Then, one final, garbled message. Not alone. They are in C. Silence. Dev exhaled. That doesn't sound good. Ethan stood up, gripping his machete. It means we still have a chance. If there are people left at the base, we need to get to them. Greg shook his head. You're insane. That place is a death trap. Mia crossed her arms. Then what do we do? Just sit here and wait to die? The tension in the room was thick. Greg looked at them, then at the boarded-up windows. Finally, he sighed. If you really want to go, I might know a way. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash sounded from outside. Ethan rushed to the window. His blood ran cold. A group of infected was tearing through the street. But these weren't normal zombies. They moved in packs, their jerky, unnatural movements eerily in sync. Their eyes glowed with a faint, almost predatory intelligence. Then, one of them turned its head, directly at the diner. It had heard them. Everyone, move! Ethan barked. The group scrambled, grabbing their weapons as the first undead smashed through the glass. And then the real fight began. Glass shattered as the first zombie crashed through the diner window. The creature landed on all fours, its grotesque body twitching unnaturally. Its eyes locked onto Ethan, and for a brief second, it didn't move, just watched him. Then, it lunged. Ethan barely had time to react. He sidestepped, swinging his machete in a deadly arc. The blade connected, slicing through the zombie's neck, but it didn't die. The thing twisted midair, landing on its feet even without its head fully attached. A horrible gurgling noise came from its throat as it snapped its own head back into place. Mia screamed. What the hell is that? Greg didn't wait to find out. We need to go, he shouted, already darting toward the back door. Dev hesitated, gripping his pipe. But Now! Ethan barked. More of the infected were pouring in through the broken windows, their movements eerily coordinated. Some of them crawled along the walls, their fingers digging into the plaster like insects. Ethan grabbed Dev and shoved him toward the exit. Move! They burst through the kitchen door, sprinting into the alley behind the diner. The cold night air hit them, but there was no time to stop. Behind them, the undead swarmed the building, their shrieks echoing into the night. Greg led them through a maze of narrow alleys and ruined buildings, his breathing ragged. There's a sewer access point 2 blocks from here, he gasped. A sewer? Dev nearly tripped. You want us to go underground with those things? You'd rather stay up here with them? Greg shot back. Ethan knew they didn't have time to argue. Just keep running. The group pushed forward, but the infected were fast, too fast. Their clawed hands scraped against metal dumpsters, their snarling voices echoing in unison, as if they were communicating. And then, one of them jumped. A zombie leaped from a rooftop, landing right in front of them. Mia barely stopped in time, her breath catching in her throat. The creature stood taller than the others, its twisted spine jutting through its rotting skin. Its eyes, once human, were now a sickly, glowing white. And then, it spoke. Not a word. Not a sentence. Just a horrible, guttural sound, Ethan's name. Ethan. Ethan froze. His blood turned to ice. Mia grabbed his arm. Ethan, we have to go. The creature tilted its head, as if it understood her words. Then, with an unnatural, bone-cracking movement, it charged. Ethan didn't think. He fired his pistol, the gunshot echoing through the ruined city. The bullet hit the zombie's skull. And it kept coming. Greg cursed. Run. The group turned and sprinted. The sewers were their only hope now. But getting there would be a nightmare. The air was thick with the scent of rot and burning flesh. The shrieking of the undead echoed behind them as Ethan, Mia, Dev, and Greg sprinted toward their only chance of survival, the sewer access point. Almost there. Greg shouted, pointing ahead. A rusted manhole cover lay at the end of the alley, half covered by debris. Beyond it, the city was a graveyard of firelit ruins, with dozens of zombies crawling over wrecked cars and collapsed buildings. Some moved on all fours, their joints bending in unnatural ways. Others stood eerily still, watching. Waiting. Mia reached the manhole first and dropped to her knees. She dug her fingers under the rusted cover, heaving with all her strength. It won't budge, she gasped. Dev crouched beside her. Move. He swung his metal pipe against the edges, loosening years of grime. Ethan grabbed the sides and yanked hard. Clang. The cover popped free. Go. Ethan ordered. Greg didn't hesitate, he jumped in first. Mia followed, then Dev. Ethan turned for one last look, and froze. The zombie that spoke his name was standing at the alley's entrance. Its body twitched unnaturally, and its glowing white eyes were locked directly on him. Then, it grinned. Ethan didn't breathe. Zombies don't grin. The creature let out a strange, choking laugh. Then. It took a step forward, then another, faster this time. Ethan dropped into the sewer and slammed the cover shut above him. Thud. Thud. The creature's claws scraped against the metal. But then, silence. For a moment, all Ethan could hear was his own heartbeat. Then Greg whispered, I told you they were changing. The sewers were worse than expected. The air was damp and foul, a mix of sewage, mold, and something else, something rotten. Water dripped from rusted pipes, and the faint sound of skittering echoed through the tunnels. Dev shivered. I swear, if I see a rat the size of a dog, I'm done. Stay close, Ethan muttered, gripping his machete. We don't know what's down here. Greg led the way through the tunnels, his movements tense. There's an old maintenance room up ahead. We can rest there for a bit. Mia frowned. How do you know so much about this place? Greg hesitated. Used to be a truck driver, remember? Had a job that required me to know these tunnels. Ethan didn't buy it. But right now, they had bigger problems. They turned a corner and stopped dead in their tracks. Bodies. At least 10 corpses lay in a heap, twisted and torn apart. Some were missing limbs, others had gaping holes in their chests. But the worst part? They weren't all human. One of the bodies had black, vein-like growths covering its skin, its mouth stretched open in a silent scream. Another had elongated fingers ending in claw-like tips. Mia covered her mouth. What did this? Then, one of the bodies twitched. Greg took a step back. We need to. It moved again. Then another. One by one, the corpses began to rise. Run! Ethan shouted. The group sprinted down the tunnel as the undead crawled after them, their bones cracking and twisting in unnatural ways. Greg pointed ahead. There! The maintenance room. They reached the rusted door, and Greg shoved it open. Everyone stumbled inside, and Ethan slammed the door shut, locking it. Heavy breathing filled the silence. Then Dev whispered, "What the hell is happening to them?" Greg turned away, his face pale. "You don't want to know." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You do, though. Don't you?" Greg didn't answer. But Ethan knew the truth. Greg was hiding something. And whatever it was, it could get them all killed. The maintenance room was cold and damp, lit only by a dim emergency light flickering on the ceiling. The metal walls were lined with old tools, rusted pipes, and a map of the sewer system, marked with strange red symbols. Ethan caught his breath and turned to Greg, gripping his machete. "Start talking." Greg looked away. "Talking about what?" "You know exactly what," Ethan snapped. "The way you knew these tunnels. The way you reacted to those things outside. What the hell aren't you telling us?" Mia crossed her arms. "You knew those bodies would move, didn't you?" Dev frowned. "And what were those red veins on them?" Greg sighed and ran a hand through his dirty hair. "I was hoping we wouldn't run into them." He took a deep breath. "I used to work for a private research group. Before the outbreak, we were experimenting with biological mutations." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You were involved in this?" "No. Not directly," Greg said quickly. "I was just transporting supplies to a lab on the outskirts of the city. They were working on something called Project Revenant. Some kind of biological enhancement. But things went wrong. Really wrong." Mia's eyes widened. "You're saying this wasn't just some virus?" Greg nodded grimly. "It started as a virus. But they were trying to create something else." He swallowed. "Those things in the tunnels? They're not normal zombies. They're part of the experiment." Dev backed away. "You knew about this and still let us down here?" Greg raised his hands. "I thought we could avoid them. The ones down here are different. They've been mutating longer than the ones on the surface." He hesitated. "And some of them might still be evolving." Before anyone could respond, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the tunnels. Mia turned pale. "Tell me that was a pipe shifting." Then, something slammed against the door. Bang. The metal groaned. Bang. A low, distorted hissing filled the air. The sound of something inhuman. Greg paled. "Oh no." Ethan grabbed his gun. "What the hell is that?" Greg's voice was barely a whisper. "Something worse." The door exploded inward. The horror in the tunnels. The creature that stepped inside was twice the size of a normal human, its twisted limbs covered in dark, pulsating veins. Its face was half-rotten but disturbingly human, with glowing white eyes that radiated an unnatural intelligence. And then, it spoke. But not in words. A garbled, guttural mimicry of human voices. Bits and pieces of phrases, stitched together like a nightmare. "Help me. Don't leave. It hurts." Mia shuddered. "No. No, no, no." Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired 2 rounds into its chest. The creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it twitched, cracked its neck, and charged. Ethan barely dove out of the way as it slammed into the wall, denting the metal. Dev swung his pipe at its head, but the creature caught it mid-air. With an effortless jerk, it ripped the weapon from Dev's hands and tossed it aside. Greg scrambled back. "We can't fight it. We have to run." The creature twisted its head toward him. Then, it smiled. Ethan grabbed a nearby wrench and hurled it at the emergency gas pipe overhead. The metal cracked, hissing gas flooded the room. "Everyone out," he shouted. Mia and Dev sprinted through the side door. Greg hesitated, too long. The creature lunged, its claws slicing into Greg's shoulder. Greg screamed. Ethan grabbed Greg's collar and yanked him free, shoving him through the door. He slammed it shut, locking the monstrous thing inside. Then, boom. The room erupted into flames as the leaking gas ignited. The explosion rocked the tunnels, sending Ethan and the others tumbling to the ground. For a moment, silence. Then, Mia gasped. "Greg!" Greg lay on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His skin was already turning pale. Dev's face darkened. "He's infected." Greg's breathing was ragged. "No. I can fight it." He looked at Ethan, his eyes full of desperation. "Don't let me turn into one of those things." Ethan clenched his jaw. They had a choice to make. Kill Greg now. Or take the risk. The flickering fire from the exploded maintenance room cast eerie shadows across the tunnel walls. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning flesh, but Ethan, Mia, and Dev had bigger problems. Greg was infected. He sat slumped against the tunnel wall, clutching his bleeding shoulder. His face was already paler than before, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The dark veins creeping from his wound weren't normal, they were spreading. Dev took a step back, gripping his metal pipe tightly. "He's turning." Mia's breathing was shaky. "Not yet, maybe we can." "There's no cure," Dev snapped. "We all know what happens next. He'll start twitching, then growl, then." Greg let out a low groan. Everyone froze. He lifted his head, eyes glassy. "Ethan." His voice was weak. "Don't let me become one of them." Ethan's grip on his machete tightened. He'd made this promise before, to others. And every time, it ended the same way. A bullet. A blade. A choice. But something felt wrong this time. Greg wasn't fighting them. He wasn't showing any signs of aggression. Then he whispered, "There's a way to stop it." Mia's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Greg swallowed hard. "The research I told you about, they weren't just creating monsters. They were working on a way to delay the infection. A suppressant." Ethan crouched in front of him. "And where is it?" Greg let out a shuddering breath. "The lab, where this all started. The suppressant was still in testing, but it slowed the mutation. If we can get there." Dev scoffed. "You expect us to go straight into the heart of the outbreak to find some experimental drug that might not even work?" Greg locked eyes with Ethan. "It's our only chance." Ethan hesitated. Was it worth the risk? Then, something shifted in the tunnel. A slow, wet dragging sound. Dev whispered, "Tell me that's just water." The dragging grew louder. Ethan turned his head slowly. And his blood ran cold. The monster survived. It stood in the darkness, its charred, melted skin bubbling from the fire. But it was still standing. Still grinning. And it wasn't alone. Behind it, more infected emerged from the shadows. But these weren't just regular zombies. Their bodies were changing, elongated limbs, twisted bones, glowing veins running under their rotting skin. They had evolved. Mia gripped Ethan's arm. "We need to run." Greg struggled to stand. "If we go to the lab, we have a chance." Dev shook his head. "Screw that. I'm not dying for him." Then, Dev swung his pipe at Greg. Mia gasped. "Dev!" Greg barely dodged, stumbling back. "What the hell?" Dev's eyes were wild. "We cut our losses now. I'm not taking chances with an infected guy slowing us down." Ethan stepped between them. "Put the pipe down, Dev." Dev's knuckles whitened around the weapon. "Move." Ethan didn't. A tense silence filled the tunnel. Then, a horrible howl tore through the air. The monsters were coming. "Fine." Dev spat. "Do whatever you want. But I'm not dying here." Before anyone could stop him, Dev turned and ran. Mia called after him, "Dev, wait." But it was too late. Dev sprinted straight into the darkness. And the moment he disappeared, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the tunnels. Then, silence. Mia covered her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Oh my God. Greg clenched his fists. We need to move. Now. Ethan nodded. They had no choice. With the monsters closing in, they ran deeper into the tunnels, following Greg's lead. Toward the only thing that could save them. Or kill them all. The tunnels twisted in endless directions, but Greg led the way with purpose. The distant howls of the creatures echoed behind them, a reminder that they had no time to waste. Mia clutched her side, panting. How much farther? Greg wiped sweat from his forehead. The veins on his arm were spreading. Not far. The lab is just beyond the old water treatment facility. Ethan glanced at him. Greg was slowing down. His face was clammy, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The infection was getting worse. We need to hurry, Ethan muttered. The trio emerged from the tunnel into a massive underground chamber. Pipes crisscrossed the ceiling, and an enormous rusted metal door stood at the far end, half covered in overgrown fungus and decay. Above it, barely visible through the grime, was a faded sign. Restricted access, Project Revenant Facility. Mia's voice was barely a whisper. This is it? Greg staggered toward a nearby control panel, his fingers trembling. It should still open. He slammed his fist against a red override button. A loud hissing filled the air as the metal door groaned, gears grinding. Slowly, too slowly, it began to open. And then, a chilling, distorted voice rang through the chamber. Help me. Ethan whirled around. Standing in the tunnel behind them was a figure wrapped in darkness, its skin pulsing with veins of glowing white. It was no longer just a zombie. It had become something worse. It cocked its head unnaturally, then spoke again. Ethan. Ethan's blood ran cold. It knew his name. Greg gasped. No. That's not possible. The thing grinned, then charged. Ethan raised his machete, but the creature moved too fast. Before he could react, it was on him, claws swiping toward his throat. Mia screamed. Bang! A gunshot ripped through the air. The creature staggered back, a bullet hole in its skull. But it didn't fall. It just laughed. Then, it wasn't alone anymore. From the tunnels, more infected poured in, dozens of them, twisted and mutated, their bodies barely human. Greg's voice was hoarse. Inside. Now. The door was only halfway open. Mia and Greg slipped through the gap. Ethan was right behind them, but just as he dove for the opening, a clawed hand grabbed his ankle. He turned, the creature was inches away, its rotten breath on his face. Ethan kicked hard, breaking free, then rolled through the gap. The door slammed shut behind them. For a moment, silence. Then, the pounding began. The creatures were trying to break in. The lab isn't empty. The corridor ahead was dimly lit by emergency lights. The walls were lined with glass observation chambers, their contents long decayed. The entire lab smelled of chemical rot and death. Greg coughed, leaning against the wall. His hands were shaking. The suppressant. It should be in the main lab. Ethan and Mia helped him forward, navigating through the facility's ruins. Then, a light flickered ahead. Mia tensed. We're not alone. A shadow moved at the end of the hallway. Ethan raised his machete. Who's there? A figure stepped into view, a woman in a tattered lab coat, her eyes sunken, her face pale. She aimed a pistol at them. Drop your weapons, she said, her voice hoarse. Ethan hesitated. Who are you? She didn't lower the gun. The last scientist of Project Revenant. Mia whispered, you worked here? The woman nodded. And if you're looking for the suppressant? She glanced at Greg, her eyes darkening. You're already too late. Greg's breathing was labored. The veins on his arm had spread up to his neck, his skin now a sickly shade of gray. He barely stood, propped against Ethan and Mia. The scientist, her pistol still raised, took a step closer. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Ethan's grip on his machete tightened. Then explain it to us. The woman's sunken eyes darted to Greg. The suppressant won't save him. It's a lie. Greg groaned, his knees buckling. That's not possible. We were working on it. You were working on a delay, not a cure, the scientist corrected. Even if I gave you the last dose, it would only buy you a few hours. Then the infection would take over. Mia gasped. Then why were you testing it? The scientist's face darkened. Because the people funding this project never intended to stop the virus. Ethan's pulse pounded. What are you saying? The woman exhaled shakily. Project Revenant wasn't meant to be a cure. It was meant to create something beyond human. Something evolved. Greg's body convulsed suddenly, and he let out a low, guttural groan. His fingers twitched. His eyes rolled back. Mia shook him. Greg! Stay with us. The scientist's voice was grim. He's at the tipping point. Either he dies now, or he becomes one of them. Ethan's hands clenched. We're not just going to kill him. Before anyone could respond. Boom! The entire facility shook violently. The door they had barricaded was breached. And the creatures, hundreds of them, were pouring inside. The final fight had begun. No way out. The scientist cursed. They found us. Ethan hoisted Greg onto his shoulder. Where's the exit? She hesitated. There's an emergency passage, but it's locked down. Then unlock it. Mia yelled. The woman ran to a control panel and started frantically typing. It'll take 3 minutes to override. The growls and screeches grew louder. Ethan gritted his teeth. We hold them off. 3 minutes. Mia grabbed a metal rod. Let's end this. The creatures came charging in, feral, mutated, unstoppable. Ethan swung his machete, severing a rotting head. Mia stabbed a rod through a zombie's chest. The scientist fired her pistol, picking off the faster ones. Greg twitched on the floor, his body spasming as he fought the inevitable transformation. Then, the leader stepped forward. The massive, half-human, half-nightmare creature that had spoken to Ethan before. It grinned that same awful grin. You! It rasped, its voice a horrible echo. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby fuel canister and hurled it at the beast. Bang! Mia shot it mid-air, a fiery explosion engulfed the horde. But the leader walked through the flames. Ethan barely had time to react before it was on him, claws tearing at his side. He grunted in pain, slashing wildly. The monster grabbed him by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Mia screamed. Ethan! The creature leaned in. You should have joined us. Then, a gunshot. Greg, trembling, barely conscious, had fired the scientist's pistol. The bullet ripped through the monster's skull. For the first time, it staggered. Ethan broke free, slamming his machete into its head. With a final, blood-curdling shriek, the monster collapsed. The scientist yelled, "The exit's open. Move!" Ethan grabbed Greg. Mia covered their backs as they sprinted through the emergency hatch. The facility collapsed behind them, sealing the nightmare inside. The end of the line. They emerged into the cold morning air, finally free from the underground hell. But Greg was barely alive. He gasped, looking at Ethan with unfocused eyes. I did good, right? Mia held his hand. You did, Greg. You saved us. He smiled weakly. Good. Then, he stopped breathing. Silence. Ethan closed his eyes. Greg was gone. Mia wiped her tears. What now? The scientist looked at them grimly. This isn't over. The virus is still out there. And the people who created it, they're still alive. Ethan clenched his jaw. They had survived. But the war was just beginning. The end.